I've been leaving apples in the same hollow stump since 1986. That sentence by itself sounds small, a humble habit of an old ranger. But if you knew what those apples bought me, you would understand why I still go back on cold mornings, why I keep a battered notebook under my pillow, why I swear by whatever conscience I have left to protect what I learned in those trees. I fed the same Bigfoot for decades. What he showed me will change the way you think about intelligence in the wild, and it will force you to reckon with a quieter, darker truth. Parts of the system that should have protected them instead helped hide what was happening. If you're the sort who wants the pictures and the measurements before you believe a story, there are photographs, plaster casts, and pages from my field journal in the link in the description. I don't post locations. I never will. These things exist to document, not to expose. I was 28 on October 15, 1986, a forest ranger who still tied his boots the old way and believed a problem could be fixed with a respectful conversation. I had just finished a second tour fighting late-season fires, and I'd been reassigned back to District 7, old-growth stands, rocky ridges, and more elk than people. The call came in at dusk. A hunting cabin off Trail 12 had been vandalized, boards torn, a rifle rack smashed, and prints around the clearing that the hunter who found them swear they were human-shaped and impossible at once. I drove myself out there because Bill Henderson asked me to. Bill was a ranger 3 decades my senior, a man whose face had been carved by wind, and who kept his rifle not for hunting, but for miles walked. He had an easy way of telling you to look twice before deciding you understood the world. That evening, the logging road ate our truck tires in gravel. Light died early behind the firs. The sky smelled like wet iron. We parked and walked the last mile on foot, headlamps slicing clean yellow cones across the underbrush. The prints were the first thing that set the hair along my arms on edge. They trailed the clearing like a second set of footsteps belonging to someone taller than any man I've measured. Each print was 17 inches long, 7 inches wide, the impressions clear and deep where the soil held a memory. Between prints, a rhythm, a stride that averaged 6 feet. I crouched and felt the smell of the ground, old sap, crushed moss, the faint tang of something like musk. There were no claws, the toes were rounded and subtle, the impression of weight distributed in a way that suggested upright motion, not quadruped. I made plaster casts that night. The mix was sloppy by the headlamp, but they set hard enough to keep their shape. I wrote the measurements in my journal with an ink that bled on damp paper. 17 inches by 7, stride 6 feet, heel shape rounded, lateral toe callus.
Bill watched me, his expression unreadable, like he had negotiated with many things in the woods and only seldom lost the calculation of risk. Then came the sound, low, close, and oddly musical. It wasn't an animal call I'd ever cataloged. It was more like someone clearing a throat at the end of a long sentence, a resonant hum that vibrated the air and then retreated into a silence that was louder than anything. The forest held its breath. I turned, and across the clearing, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure that made me forget to breathe. He was not the monster of television or folklore. He was large, yes, broader in the shoulders than any man in my memory, and taller than I would have guessed, his head disappearing into a mane of dark hair. His face, where the light touched, was not a mask. It had planes and folds like any primate, eyes dull and reflective in the lamplight. He stood upright, not hunched, and there was a deliberateness in the way he watched us that felt like attention, not the blind, feral curiosity I had expected. When he stepped back into the trees, the leaves settled over him as if they were drawing a curtain. For weeks after, I could not sleep without thinking of those eyes. I kept the casts on my bureau, and I kept returning to that hollow stump where we had found a half-bitten apple and, strangely, a small rock placed on its flat side beside the fruit. Someone had stacked the rock, as if to say, "I remember this." I made notes. Date, October 15, 1986. Time, 1942. Temperature, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind, light from the east. I wrote what I felt. The more measured forensic lines balanced my fear. Prints X3, casts made, sample soil pH recorded. But my notebook also held the other words, wonder, guilt, the sense that something old and careful had seen me and decided I was not to be torn apart. Bill advised caution without preaching. Document everything, he said, and offered the soft kind of counsel that comes from someone who had seen people make fools of themselves in the woods, and in other cases, watched men lose their lives for something as simple as a bad assumption. He suggested we stay quiet. Let the evidence speak, he told me. but his eyes had another language. He'd worked with authorities before, animal control, wildlife biologists, the occasional federal presence when rare species came up. He had seen how the right facts in the right hands were folded away with an efficiency that left them invisible to the public. He didn't say more, and I didn't press. Some things in his silence were louder than any report. On November 7th, 1986, I was back on a routine patrol when I heard it again, that deep vocalization, longer and now patterned, like a phrase being repeated. That evening, I followed the sound to a small clearing where a fallen hemlock lay like a knotted spine. There was Old Jack. I named him that later, because names make us accountable, sitting on the far side of the log. He watched me.
I sat on the same log, careful to show him I was no threat, and for 20 minutes we did nothing but look at one another. I had the apple in my pack. It was a trivial thing, a hunger of habit more than generosity, and yet handing it over felt like crossing a border. He did not snatch it with the animal quickness I'd seen in foxes or raccoons. Instead, Old Jack took the apple with both hands, held it for a heartbeat, and then placed it gently on the log between us. He didn't eat first. He tapped the skin with a measured finger, then raised his hand and touched the log, then my boot, in a pattern that in my later notes I called a sequence. Object, substrate, person. The movement had grammar. When I left that night, my boots lighter with an odd mix of fear and glory, I began to understand intelligence that did not fit our usual checklist. It wasn't only size or dexterity or the ability to plan. Intelligence, as Old Jack displayed, included ritual, memory, exchange, and restraint. He could wait, he could hold, he could give back. I did not tell the town. I told Bill, and he only nodded, a gesture that retained both caution and a spark I could not place. He arranged for me to catalog everything officially, to take photos, to store casts in a locked cabinet. We labeled the evidence with dates and case numbers. I opened a private journal too, a smaller, leather-bound book that I kept in my bunkhouse drawer, and in which I recorded things I could not make official without risking the family's safety. The way Old Jack arranged his offerings in the morning, the time of day he hummed a low, throaty note that seemed to answer the wind, and the way he would circle a sapling and run fingers down its bark like a person reading Braille. The watershed moment that made me stop being just an observer and become a participant was not sudden. It was a series of small transactions that threaded together. I left an apple one dawn, and the apple was gone when I returned at dusk. The following week, I found a neat pile of huckleberries where my apple had been. These weren't the random scatterings of a raccoon. The berries were sorted, by size, into 3 small piles. By my own training, I began to see intent. The third time, I left a pocket knife wrapped in cloth at the stump, and the next morning found my old leather compass in its place, the compass I had misplaced years before. It wasn't a take and take, it was a communication. There were intellectual markers, tool use beyond simple opportunism, signs of caching, small piles of sharpened twigs, a flat stone with a groove worn by repeated use, as if used to strip saplings or grind something, arranged stones forming what looked like a sun pattern on the ground. More than that, Old Jack reacted to changes in routine. When I walked a new route and didn't leave anything by the stump for 3 days, I found that he had left a stick in the doorway of the cabin, leaning it against the threshold like a note. Once, after a winter storm, he pushed aside a hinged board to reveal a small bundle of birch bark with a smoked berry in it. The berry was preserved. Someone had planned for the future. In the winter of 1987, Sarah appeared on the periphery of my patrols. At first, she was a shadow that copied Old Jack's movements, then a figure watching from behind a tree as he greeted me in his slow, deliberate way. When she drew nearer, different things happened. She too handled objects with care, but her gestures were more complex. She arranged leaf litter into a shallow bowl. She picked small flowers and tucked them into the grooves of stones. She made a place on the forest floor that looked like a bed. When little Jack arrived the following spring, I understood what I had suspected in a way that settled the matter. This was not a lone creature. This was a family. Watching little Jack grow over the years became, in its own way, the quietest evidence of intelligence. He learned like a child, watching his parents' hands, mimicking the way they picked berries, how they balanced on logs, the cadence of their hums. He would play with stacked sticks, taking them down and rebuilding them in slightly different configurations each time.
One summer afternoon, I found him sitting with a stone in his lap, rubbing it with a strip of bark until it shone. He looked up at me with an expression I still struggle to name, one part curiosity, one part shy test, and then handed me a flattened pine cone, its scales pried open and laid in order like a small handcrafted fan. The exchange felt ceremonial. I began to think in terms of language, not words as we define them, but systems of reference, the placement of stones, the order of fruit, the way a gesture toward a fallen tree could indicate shelter or food. There were proofs of abstraction. Once, in late 1989, I returned to find a ring of smooth stones laid out around a cluster of young shoots in a clearing. The shoots were likely the early growth of edible plants, and the ring looked deliberate, perhaps a small conservation act, perhaps a way of saying, "Leave this." It felt like a shared ethic. As the trust deepened, other things crept into my awareness. Old Jack bore scars along his forearm that suggested old wounds, healed poorly and crooked. Sarah had a limp in one leg after a fall that I later learned came from an encounter with hunters. Little Jack bore the faint outline of a healed cut under his chin. The family moved with the grace of animals that count on one another for survival, but there were moments when their bodies told stories of violence. I tried to reconcile what I witnessed, deliberate intelligence, planning, social bonds, with the external realities that had always hovered at the edge of the forest.
In my early patrol notes, I wrote down local stories I'd collected, hunters' tales, an elder's account of a night when a man went missing, a trail of bones found near a stream, and the official notation of partial remains, unknown origin. There were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, lodged in old files at the county office, mention of unidentified large carcass here, animal control operation there. Bill had a way of looking at those files and then folding them back into the drawer as if they were too sharp to leave exposed. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, he would tap the top of my plaster cast with a knuckle, not as mockery, but in recognition. Evidence could be a shelter or a shackle. I began to catalog behavior the way I had once cataloged plant species, feeding rituals, nighttime calls, grooming patterns, the way they conserved heat by pressing close together. I noted deviations, old Jack's sudden avoidance of a ridge he had frequented, Sarah's increasing wariness of human scent, little Jack's tendency to avoid paths that had human footprints in them. Each deviation suggested a memory of violence. The family learned the shape of danger. By 1991, I had a small network of confidants, men and women who had spent their lives in timber and trail, a retired biologist who kept her own records, a park warden across the county line who would exchange notes under the guise of local cooperation, and Bill, who had been with me at the start, and who now carried the same hush like an oath. We did not file for sensational headlines. We used careful language in our notes. Unidentified large mammal observed, behavioral patterns suggestive of social group, evidence of trauma consistent with firearm wound. In private, Bill once said, "Never make them a myth and never make them a target. Either will get them killed." Sometimes, on patrol, I'd watch old Jack work with tools, not in the Paleolithic sense of flint and bone, but in a craftsman's way. He'd strip a branch clean with a sharp stone, fashion a notch, and then split it into thin slats. He used a flat rock with a central depression as a primitive mortar, grinding bark into fibers. The tools were simple, but their manufacture suggested planning and teaching. When little Jack was old enough, old Jack showed him the motions, their hands mirroring each other. Those hands were strong and gentle, scuffed and calloused in uneven patterns that spoke of hard work in long seasons. There was a night in 1993 that lodged under my ribs like a splinter. I had been out late, and the sky was clear enough to see Orion stand like a watchman. I found a new arrangement at the stump, an apple half-eaten, a small stick laid across it, and tucked under the bark of the stump, a waterproof container.
It was sealed with resin, and within, when I pried it open, were clippings, brittle newspaper prints that mentioned missing men, mention of traps set decades prior, and photographs that had been cropped and annotated. The clippings were not labeled with agency names. They were, in a sense, the family's private archive, items they had taken from the sites where remains had been found, things they had salvaged or witnessed and then hidden away as evidence that someone else had been there and that someone else had taken parts away. I treated that container as one would treat an answered prayer and a condemned history. Those clippings suggested more than local rumors. They suggested that when things went wrong, they were not always fixed by community seekers. Bodies had been removed, items had been confiscated. There were notes in the margins with dates and initials I could not decipher.
I thought of government files because of the careful handwriting that indicated chain of custody, and because the clippings were not ordinary press. They seemed to have been collected by someone who knew how to file a thing so it could later be denied. But I did not say the government did this the way a man might throw an accusation across a porch. I wrote instead, in the small private ledger I kept under lock, that the clippings indicated official knowledge and removal. I used careful words. Some authorities appear to have been involved in removal operations, and records suggest intervention beyond the scope of local hunting disputes. My handwriting grew cramped on that page. I added a margin note: protect family, do not disclose locations. The presence of those clippings changed the dynamic. It made secrecy necessary, not conspiratorial. If officials had taken things in the past, then exposure risked another wave of intervention the family might not survive. I thought about the logic of secrecy in the face of danger. If the government, if parts of it, or officials acting under directives I did not see, had once removed remains and artifacts, then any public attention could be a death sentence for creatures that thought and mourned and kept little archives of their losses. My responsibility hardened into something like duty. By the mid-1990s, our interactions were ritualized. On dawn patrol, I would leave food. Old Jack would reciprocate with a neat pile or a carefully selected artifact: a small carved bone, a strip of weathered leather, a pile of river-smoothed pebbles arranged by size. He showed me how he patched a worn-out spot in the bark where he slept. He pushed aside brush to reveal a shallow nest lined with ferns. Once, after I had been away on extended leave, I returned to find a new marking on the stump, his handprint pressed into a softened clay patch, palm open and deliberate, the fingers spread like a sign. I traced that same print with my fingertips and felt a connection that is difficult to put into the dry language of field reports.
Letters arrived in the mail sometimes from strangers who suspected nothing, and sometimes from those who suspected too much. I learned to answer truthfully without betraying location. Yes, I had found prints. No, I would not help organize a public hunt. No, I could not share coordinates. I kept my replies measured, because people do the strangest things when they believe the world is finally theirs to conquer. There were close calls. A pair of hunters moved into the area in late 1995, a couple of men who set snares along the game trails and whom I had to warn off repeatedly. I would find traps the next day, crude but effective. The first time I discovered one near a path little Jack favored, I dismantled it and took the wire away. I treated the trap like evidence of intent rather than a stray tool. These men were not local artisans of the forest. They were outsiders with a combative energy that smoothed quickly into the language of force. Sometimes, sitting in my cabin with the plaster casts propped against the wall and the waterproof container's clippings spread on the table like a forensic tea, I would think about what made old Jack intelligent. It was more than problem-solving or tool-making. It was the way he recognized social dynamics, understood consequence, and memorialized loss. He hid evidence not as a hiding animal might hoard food, but as someone who knew the history of what had been taken. He kept things together in small vaults. He taught little Jack to bury the family journal and to leave marks that only they understood. My private ledger filled with entries to be read later and never to be published. Each page was a compromise, a desire to record and preserve versus a promise to protect. In those pages, I noted dates when the family avoided a ridge, when Sarah's limp worsened, when old Jack's hum changed pitch in ways that matched storm fronts. I also noted my own shifting threshold of courage. There were nights I wanted to shout our findings from the mountaintop. There were others I knew would mean their extinction. And there were nights I did more than the documenting. I became an active participant in their care. Once, when Sarah returned from a patrolling circuit with a fresh wound along her flank, I could not pretend we were only observers. The wound looked as if it had been made by a bullet. I dressed it using the medicinal herbs I had been carrying for decades, plantain poultices, pine sap to knit, and I watched her suture with a clarity that was almost sacred. She accepted the treatment with a stoicism that made me ashamed for the violence humans had inflicted. When the dressing was secure, she placed one hand against my chest. Her palm was warm and calloused. Her eyes held an exchange I had no vocabulary for. Later, when old Jack came to the clearing, he traced the mark of the medicine on the cloth and then tapped his forehead, a sign I took to mean, remember, and perhaps we will pay you back in trust.
That word, trust, is small in the face of what it implied. It was a social contract, fragile and heavy, woven across years of slow exchanges.
I began to bear witness not only as a recorder of facts, but as a moral agent. I felt the balance between exposing truth that could save and revealing a truth that could kill. There are places, still, where the road bends and the trees open to a flat where the morning fog comes up like breath. I go back to those places, even in the worst weather, because the memory holds me like a debt. Sometimes in those dawns I find a fresh arrangement: 3 stones by the stump, a pile of berries, a flattened cup of moss. Sometimes there is nothing but my own boot prints in the wind. The seasons taught me patience, and the family taught me a vocabulary of caution. I have lost friends to this secrecy, men who could not accept that knowledge without public reckoning walked away, angry that I would not reveal coordinates or mount an exposure campaign. Others stayed and guarded their silence in their own ways. Bill died in 2004. I was with him when he took his last breath, and he squeezed my hand in a way that felt like approval. He had been the man who first told me to let the evidence speak, and in that final hour, I felt his advice settle into me like sediment. In all those years, I kept a private tally: the days I left apples, when I received berries, the times I found new tools, the night Sarah or old Jack followed me for 100 yards and then faded away. I charted out seasonal patterns the way one charts tides. There were winters where the family retreated deeper, and summers where they surfaced more freely. The pulses of their presence told a story of resilience and retreat. As the 90s deepened, talk in the county shifted from reckless hunting to stewardship. Environmental groups knocked on the doors of rangers and reminded them in polite language that ecosystems deserved protection. But in the margins, the old appetites did not disappear. Men still came through the timber with dogs and with schemes. When an outsider walked into a clearing and set a camera rig in 1998, it was the kind of curiosity that could not be trusted. The rig was found destroyed, the battery peeled open like a shell. We recorded the act with a clinical hand and then put the incident into the drawer. I learned to read the landscape like a book with many authors. The placement of certain rocks told me of recent occupation. A fresh bed of ferns indicated a lull in human traffic. The family taught me to read their signs too, the way they tore a branch to mark a path, the way a smooth stone was left as a talisman. Those were all words in a language I had been taught by patience rather than schooling. There was, in the back of my mind, always the danger of turning affection into possession. I had to remind myself daily that my relationship with old Jack and his family did not license me to decide their fate.
The more I learned, the more complicated the calculus became. If I reported everything to authorities, would that ensure their protection or their capture? If I did nothing, would my silence be a form of cowardice that allowed others to exploit the oblivious? These were not theoretical questions. They were live choices, moving like weather systems across the map of my life. One autumn evening in 2003, as I sat in the cabin and the rain made a steady, small percussion on the roof, I turned a page in my leather journal and noticed the handwriting tremor in my own notation. I had been keeping these pages for nearly 2 decades. The ink, like the years, had browned around the edges. I wrote a line in capital letters, as if to make it readable even in bad light. Whatever you do, do not expose them. They are not a curiosity, they are kin. I had to write it as a reminder to myself that the right thing was not always the obvious one. The pattern that formed over those years, offerings, responses, caches, clippings, scars, and above all, the family, added up to something inconvenient. Intelligence was not a trophy, it was a responsibility. Old Jack was not an oddity to be displayed. He was a living archive, a community member in a culture that had its own ethics. The more I saw, the harder it was to justify any act that would reduce them to specimens. By the time I took early retirement in 2016, the rhythm had changed again. My knees had gotten worse, the forest had new paths cut by developers farther down the valley, and the world was noisier in ways that made discreet living harder. I kept my promise. I kept the stump clean and the apples fresh. I maintained the plaster casts in a lockbox and swapped notes with a single trusted colleague who had agreed to the vow of silence. I left the waterproof container where old Jack had stashed it decades earlier, the way one protects a holy relic, with care and in layers. I would open it sometimes and feel the brittle paper edges like the teeth of history. There were new signs too,
evidence that hunters in the surrounding counties had been organized in small groups, that traps were appearing farther from roads, as if they had learned to be patient. I wrote down the dates when snares were found, the times when bloodstains marred a trail, the mornings when little Jack's play patterns became cautious games of avoidance. I noted a pattern of escalation that could not be ignored. I began to fear for the family's future in a way that was not merely sentimental. The decision I made in those years was a moral one. I would not become a loud prophet demanding proof in a public square. I would not allow the family to be a trophy for someone's social media fame. Instead, I vowed to become a shield.
My notebook is full of strategies that were not law, not official procedures, but practical measures. Changing patrol timings to throw off trackers, subtly rerouting trails used by hikers, and removing obvious snares before they could be sprung. I learned the art of erasure. I became an expert in making humans forget where to look. Yet even as I erased tracks for the family's safety, I preserved other things for history. I made copies of clippings, took additional casts, created a record of patterns that I hoped would someday be used for protection, not exploitation. This tension, to conceal and to document, became the main work of my later years. And then a small detail arrived that made my chest tighten. In late 2010, I found a photograph tucked into the waterproof container that I had never noticed before. It was a black and white image, edges chewed by time. The picture showed a clearing, and in the background what looked like human figures standing near a carcass. The figures were blurred. Nothing definitive could be read from their faces. In the corner, someone had penciled a date, indefinido. I felt then a cold cognitive dissonance, evidence of violent history matched by bureaucratic evasions that refused to be pinned down. The family had hoarded the scraps of history so they could remember, even if official channels had chosen to forget. It is at this edge, the point where evidence becomes memory, and memory must be guarded to keep life intact, that my story pauses for now. There are other chapters to follow, discoveries deeper than the stump, confrontations that tested the limits of human decency, and choices that forced me to stand between hunters and a family that had, in its own way, entrusted me with its survival. For now, I keep the ledger locked, the apples fresh, and the plaster casts wrapped in oilcloth. I keep the secret not because I am clever, but because I have learned that sometimes silence is the only language that means stay alive. After I closed that page in 2010 and pressed the brittle photograph flat between two sheets of waxed paper, things began to accelerate in ways I had feared. Not all of it bad. Some discoveries deepened my understanding of old Jack and his family in ways that made the whole arrangement feel less like secret-keeping and more like stewardship, but there were other moments when the past leaned in with sharp teeth. In early 2011, a thaw came late and hard. Snow lingered on north-facing slopes and the streams ran with a slow, cold certainty. I had been following a faint game trail that skirted a ravine when I found it, a narrow entrance carved into the roots of an upturned cedar, draped in moss and shadow. At first, I thought it was an animal den. Then the light caught on something metallic at the lip of the hollow, a scrap of tin, not rusted away but cleaned, as if someone had handled it recently. I slid closer, careful, and peered into a patch of darkness. What I saw made me think of shelters humans make out of necessity and children make out of imagination. There was a chamber, no larger than a small room, lined with woven ferns and flattened moss. Simple supports of forked branches held a low shelf, and on that shelf were things: a flat stone hollowed and polished, a length of braided leather, a smooth wooden baton with notches worn into one end, as if counting had been done there. On a stump in the corner, a pile of objects had been organized, the way old Jack organized things at the stump. Pebbles sorted by size, a small carved bone, a scrap of cloth with a faint stain. The arrangement was deliberate. I did what Bill had taught me to do the first week on the job 50 years prior: document without disturbing, photograph with the respect of a caretaker. I took a single, careful set of photos, and then left a small marker where I could re-find the spot without a map: 3 stacked stones hidden under needles, the kind of sign that wouldn't interest anyone who wasn't looking for it. I did not tell the county office. I did not tell the biologist across the line. I wrote the coordinates in code in my private ledger and put it under the false bottom of a drawer. When old Jack met me at the entrance 2 nights later, he watched me with a look that was harder to interpret than any of the earlier gestures. He tapped the doorway, then tapped his hand on his chest, then on my shoulder, the sequence I had come to read as an offering of place. He led me inside as if he were showing a visitor a small private museum. He lifted the notch stick and pointed to the worn grooves. I understood then that the notches were a counting method, perhaps seasons, perhaps events, and that someone had been marking time in a room that felt like a memory bank. There were more containers. Under a loose slate, wrapped in oilcloth, I found another waterproof jar, this time not placed for me but hidden with a deliberate nod to years of accumulating proof. Inside were clippings like the ones I had already found, but more. A yellowed print of a map with a route marked in pencil, a photograph of a man collapsed against a tree, face obscured, and an envelope with a scrap of cloth sewn into its fold. On the back of one clipping were numbers and a cramped list of place names. The handwriting was not my own. It was careful, neat, like someone who had learned how to keep records so they would not be lost. I stared at that handwriting longer than was reasonable for a man who had been trying to keep his composure for decades. I did not find names or letterheads. They were initials and dates, little administrative breadcrumbs. 1978, 1982, a note that read simply, "Remains removed." I kept thinking of Bill's knuckle-tapping the plaster cast, the unspoken lesson about how facts could be buried in proper files. The jar did not supply the whole story.
It supplied a pattern. Someone, somewhere, had indeed created a chain of handling that ended in absence. Old Jack watched me read through the jar's contents with the patience of someone whose archive had been raided by storms and men. When I looked up, he placed his hand on the map, ran 2 fingers along the penciled route, and then made a slow motion with his other hand near his temple. "Memory," he said without words. Then he tapped the back of his neck. "Pain." He tapped his forearm and then mimed a wound. The meaning was clear. The past had a voice that did not require ink to prove its existence. After that, the cave, if you could use such a grand word, became a place of careful visitation. Old Jack would sometimes bring me something he had found there, a smooth piece of bone, a pressed fern, a length of cloth whose weave suggested someone had once been in a hurry when they had to leave camp. Sometimes it was his way of saying, "We remember." Sometimes it felt like an apology for what had come before, as if keeping the pieces was a kind of funeral. A sequence of events in late 2012 would force those funerals into an emergency. Hunters had been pushing deeper that year. The timber roads had grown into thin veins that cut into territory people once let alone. In September, a new sign appeared: snares. This time they were not the crude single loops I've cut before. A skilled hand had set multiple snares along a contour line, positioned to make movement through a travel corridor impossible. The lines were baited with scent, and the soil around them was churned in a way lost on only a novice. They were a trap network. I found one set late in the evening when the light was pulling the world into a blue film. Little Jack's favorite play route ran close to the snares. I dismantled them with hands that had learned to be fast and discreet. I wrapped the wire and hid it where it could not be reused. My chest tightened as if adrenaline and sorrow had braided into one. A week later, on a patrol I had been compelled to run myself, I found a sight I had not fully imagined: fresh boot prints across an otherwise undisturbed bed of moss. They were grouped, not single-centered. The size and tread marked them as modern hunting boots, and the prints bore the sharp cut of people who knew how to move quietly through that understory. They were not local to our little circle of field hands. These were the prints of outsiders, of men who worked together. It was the morning of October 3rd, 2013, when everything went to a decision point. I had been out before dawn and left apples at the stump. The world smelled of frost. As I stepped into the clearing, I heard a sound that still sends a particular kind of chill through me. It was Sarah's voice, short, sharp, a syllabic cry I had learned to read as alarm. She wasn't singing the patterned hums or the long notes old Jack made. She was calling once and then again, quick and urgent.
A moment later, old Jack came into view, and he was moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, a loping, purposeful stride that carried within it a kind of danger. And then I saw them, 3 men standing half-hidden near the line of trees, their shoulders hunched against the cold, rifles cupped in their hands, eyes narrowed like predatory tools. They had set up a blind farther back, and their gear hung from a tree as if displayed for convenience. One of them knelt and adjusted a rangefinder in a way that made my stomach drop. They were not the casual snaresmen. They were organized. Old Jack stopped when he saw them. He made no approach. He did not snarl. He scanned their formation like a man reading a border. He then looked at me, and in that look I heard a kind of plea: do not let them take this from us. I wanted to answer as if we had learned a language: move back, stay safe. But I also knew the calculus of presence. If I left, those men might follow into the clearing and find a family exposed. If I stayed, the chance of collision increased.
I decided in a way I had never decided anything in my life. I stepped into the open. My boots on the frost made a sound I heard like a bell. The men saw me and straightened. One of them raised his rifle. "Hey!" he shouted. There was a roughness in his voice that belonged to men who thought the forest was theirs to command. "You there, what are you doing out here? This is private land." "It's public service land," I said. "I'm a retired ranger. Who are you, and what are you doing with guns pointed at animals?" He laughed, a tight sound. "Animals?" he said. "That's a big one. Where are you from, old man? You got the wrong idea." The second man stepped forward. He was younger, and his eyes were too bright. "We had reports," he said. "Tracks, stuff. You can't be in the way. Move back and don't make trouble." Before I could answer, a shot cracked. It wasn't aimed at me. It lanced the air and struck the underbrush where Little Jack had been playing earlier that week. There was a spatter of sound, a dull thump. Sarah cried out then, a sound that carried like broken glass. Old Jack answered with a noise that vibrated through my ribs. He moved with speed I did not think his size permitted. He barreled forward and was suddenly between the men and the rest of his family. I remember exactly what I felt then, the raw, burning knowledge that something was about to be taken. I will not justify what followed as bravery so much as the simplest of human reflexes. I stepped ahead of Old Jack and put my hands out, palms visible, as if to say I was nothing to be shot. "Stop!" I shouted. "Stop and you will leave." One of the hunters, the youngest, cursed and leveled his rifle again. He was shaking. "Back off, old man," he hissed. "Get out of here." I didn't move. I remember thinking how absurd it looked. A man of my shape standing between a family and 3 men with guns.
Then, because the universe has no interest in neat symbolism, a round went where teeth might have been. The shot found Sarah. She stumbled and fell, a ragged, graceless movement of wind and weight. Old Jack's cry ballooned into the cold. Little Jack scampered, an animal knowing instinctively to find cover. For a moment, time folded tight, and everything became the shape of endings. I ran. I have patched people at road accidents, wrestled bears from snares, soothed men in grief. I have done many practical things in my life because it was my job. But that day, practicalness and terror braided into a single awful competence. I grabbed Sarah's shoulder and felt the warm gush of blood. The wound in her side had already bled. The blood was dark and smelled of iron and fur. I pressed my hand to it, felt the heartbeat still steady under my own palm. I tore a strip of cloth from my jacket and wound it tight around the wound like improvising a bandage. I stuffed moss into the edges where blood seeped, knowing plantain and clean moss would help. Old Jack hovered like a guardian. He watched, eyes huge and wet. When I was finished with the first dressing, he reached out and very gently pressed his hand to Sarah's flank, a slow, solemn touch that betrayed confidence and fear at once. Then he took a small, odd step back and looked at the men as if making a calculation. The men, faced with the sight of a massive creature and a man doing the work of a medic upon it, seemed to make their own calculation. They fired again, twice into the air. A warning shot this time, meant to frighten rather than kill, or perhaps meant to take a life with a lack of precision. The younger one barked, "You can't hide him. We're taking him in. That's a trophy if I ever saw one." There was a greed in his voice that made bile rise in my throat. I had to make a choice that was not simple. To call out to other rangers or to the local sheriff might bring help, but it would also bring an official process I had seen before. Investigators, tags, removal, and a chain of custody that usually ended in something being shipped away. I thought of the clippings wrapped in oilcloth. I thought of the photograph with the penciled-out date, indefinito. I thought of the handful of people who had been consumed by the need to expose and the way their exposure had torn families apart. And then I thought of Sarah's eye, which was closed and already hardening with pain. "Take him," I said to the hunters, and my voice surprised me with a steadiness I didn't know I had. "Take me. Leave them. You want a confrontation? Take me. Leave the animals and go. This is their home." For a heartbeat, their faces contorted with that ugly mix of victory and doubt. The youngest one lowered his rifle a fraction. The man with the rangefinder looked between his 2 partners, and the third, an older man whose hair was streaked with gray, said, "You think they'd let you walk away, old man? They'd come back."
"They'd come back anyway, if you make a show of it," I said. "If you take me, you put the weight of the law between you and those animals. You want that? You want scrutiny on you, on your methods? You don't know what you're messing with out here. Get out." There was more to it than bluff. I had a reputation in certain corners, the sort of reputation built by decades of knowing how to make men uncomfortable when they thought the law bent to their will. I was not bluffing about dying if it came to that. I was simply offering myself as a sacrificial ledger entry if they'd rather not have them on record. The gray-haired man's posture softened minutely.
He looked at his partners. Something in their exchange shifted from boldness to the small, cowardly calculus of men who prefer profit without fuss. They did not take me. They backed off in slow, stuttering steps, keeping their guns leveled until they were sure there was no further resistance. The younger one kicked at a clump of grass, his face twisted with a hate I will not forget. "You can't keep this secret forever, old man," he spat. "We'll be back. There's money in it." They left with a threat, not a promise. The forest resumed its breath after they were gone, but the sound was strained. Old Jack sat down in the clearing and put both hands to his face. He wept, in a way, a low rolling sound that might be called mourning among his kind. I sat beside him and did what hands do. I wrapped the rest of my jacket around Sarah and checked the bandage again. Night threatened, and the air turned hard. We moved them that night, because the alternative was worse, to wait for another patrol to find the bloodstain in the tracks. I set up a makeshift sled using my old canvas pack and some saplings, and we carried Sarah together, old Jack supporting the body's weight where he could, and I shouldering the rest. Little Jack came close and pressed his forehead to Sarah's back, leaving a little intermingled patch of fur and hair. When we reached a deeper hollow, a place I'd found earlier, an old landslide scar that was damp and heavily wooded, I made a bed of ferns and lined it with what clean cloth I had. We worked through the night. I managed to stitch a torn muscle with the needle and the thread I carried for grafting small plants, because sometimes the tools of one trade serve another. Sarah lived through that night. She changed color slowly, and the fever that comes with deep wounds rose in the morning and then eased as plantain and rest did their small miracles. Old Jack did not leave her side. At dawn, he presented me with something I still keep under glass, a small piece of wire, twisted into a loop, with a bit of the hunter's coaxial line still attached. He had found it where I'd dismantled a snare and kept it as a relic of violence. He offered it to me like an agreement. I took it and placed it into my pocket. The hunters did come back, but not in the way the younger man had imagined.
They came back with flashlights and bravado a few days later, looking for signs and with a small posse of friends in tow. They ransacked the area, kicked aside logs, and left a mess that made me want to puke. I watched them from the trees, while old Jack watched from his hiding places. They found nothing in our deeper hollow, and they left angry, cursing the land and vowing vengeance. The older man recognized me not by face, but by gait and presence. He muttered that I should be careful. He was right in the practical sense, but wrong in the moral sense. I was past careful. I was committed. Word trickled through the fringes of the county. There were rumors, the kind that feed themselves on rumor and then metamorphose. I got 2 anonymous calls on the landline, one from a man asking if any rangers were missing in that area, another from someone who wanted to buy any specimen found. I answered neither. There was a fallout from that confrontation that shaped the next half-decade. I tightened the measures I had been taking for years. I swapped notes with my confidant on the other side of the county line. He moved camera traps to confuse trackers, set false trails, and orchestrated a narrative of misdirection. We started leaving false signs, human footprints leading away from core habitat into bogs, and false snares that would tangle gear and waste time. It is not noble work. It is the work of people who know that the best defense is slow, boring, and invisible to the headlines. But there came a day, one I remember with a clarity that is almost painful, when the line between guardian and betrayer blurred. It was 2014. Drought that year made the game trails concentrate animal movement, and with more animals came more hunters and more cameras and a kind of modern greed that smells not of meat but of fame. A man from a television show, he had a truck with a logo and a laugh like a market hawker, came through asking prying questions. I shut him down. I told him I had nothing to share, and he laughed and said, "Everybody's hiding something up here. You've got to be kidding yourself if you think you can keep it all." He left, but the smell of pursuit lingered. In the months that followed, new equipment turned up, a sniffer dog unit, someone with a portable scanner, and once, in the dead of night, the whine of a quadrotor that cut through the valley like a dishonest insect. Technology, I learned, made secrecy harder. Old Jack learned it too, and, in front of me, demonstrated an instinct I had thought belonged to myth. He led his family to places where the ground smelled of water, and turned the route by tiny alterations, using the scent of crushed mint and fern to confuse the sense of a tracking dog. It was ingenious, humble, and terrifyingly effective. I retired in 2016, not only because my knees required it, and because managers at the office wanted younger men on the roster, but because the world outside the timber was changing into something less manageable.
Retirement meant different hours, but it also meant I had fewer obligations to explain the oddities in my logbooks. I moved to the small house at the valley's rim, kept the plaster casts in a lockbox, and kept the journal under the mattress as always. Old Jack, Sarah, and Little Jack changed like any family with age. Little Jack became less of a boy and more of a presence with his own rhythms. His shoulders broadened, his curiosity sharpened. Sarah's limp remained, a testament and warning. Old Jack's hum grew deeper and less frequent, as if the world measured out his patience. He would come close on certain mornings and touch his palm to my chest, the gesture I have catalogued as an oath. He trusted me to keep their history safe, and I accepted that trust as a covenant. Even as I kept it, the territory contracted. Developers pushed farther up the valley, and a new road was proposed that would carry people and machines closer to the places where the family lived. At a public meeting about the project, I sat in a folding chair with my hands folded in my lap. I listened to men talk about progress and access and the need to break ground for tourism and resource. I wanted to stand and say that in those trees lived thinking beings who arranged pebbles to mark a season, who taught their young how to count grooves on a stick, who kept a waterproof container of clippings because someone had once had the cruelty to take pieces of their brothers from the earth. I wanted to tell them about the notches and the ring of stones, the way Sarah had once made a bed of moss like a human making a child's sleeping place. Instead, I kept my mouth closed and wrote my objections in measured language that would never have the dramatic effect of shouting. Because there are lines a man puts in the dirt that he will not cross. I would not reveal coordinates. I would not lead anyone to them for a thrill or for profit. If people were to be protected, they had to remain unknowable to a world that converts everything into commodity. That last conviction hardened when I found, in late 2017, a notebook page written in a hand I did not recognize, tucked into the waterproof jar, a list of serial numbers, a mention of an operation, and the penciled notation indefinido, where a date should have been. These were breadcrumb hints that some investigations had happened long ago, with the kind of administrative language that could bury a body under 3 years' worth of reports. I continued my vigil in ways that were simultaneously small and significant. I learned to be stealthier than the men who came to take. I took down camera rigs that someone in a hurry had left in obvious places. I would swap the bait on traps so they would draw away strays but not the family. I kept a record, always in code, of the patterns of their presence. I left apples on cold mornings, and sometimes found in return elaborate arrangements of thorns and berries placed in a way that said, "We're still here."
Then, in the fall of 2018, things changed again, less violently this time, but in a way that undercut even the best laid protections. A group of hunters with a reputation for following leads across county lines moved into an adjacent ridge. They were methodical, patient, and they had equipment. We noticed by the small changes, the way trails were walked, the cigarette butts left in unusual places, a shimmer of new boot prints crossing old ones. They were the kind of people who thought the world owed them taxidermy. On a bitter morning when the mist hung low and the leaves were gone, Bill's words returned to me like a chant. Let the evidence speak. I had been letting it speak in my own way, but the evidence was no match for men with maps and money. That is what I thought as I watched, from a distance, the hunting party drop wire that glinted like a seam across their path. They were closer than I'd thought. The youngest of them, always the ones who think themselves less responsible, stumbled into a clearing that had been a kitchen for the family. He found, for the first time in years, a place where old Jack had left a note in the form of an arrangement, a ring of stones around young sprouts intended as a preservation symbol. He laughed and thought it superstition. He didn't see the living hand that rose from behind the log. We tried to steer them away. I left little signs of human presence elsewhere, and for a week they chased false tracks. But their persistence, call it hunger, call it entitlement, eventually paid off. In March of 2019, they cornered Little Jack. I will never forgive the image of that day. Little Jack, now young and tall, had been out of the den with old Jack and Sarah moving slowly behind him, and a dog, trained and hot on a scent, breathed too close. There were shouts, and the hunter with the dog came running, his laugh turning into a shout of alarm. The dog lunged, and Little Jack reacted the way any creature with a spine would. He swung, he dodged. The man tripped, cursed, and in that moment, because the human heart is eager for the simplest of victories, a shot rang out. The dog yelped. Little Jack went down.
This time there was no heroic running in from me. I arrived seconds after the blast, breathless, and found little Jack sprawled. Not gone, but badly hurt. Old Jack had him wrapped in his arms, and Sarah, her limp almost invisible, was pressing a hand to the wound as if she could stop blood by will alone. The hunters saw me. They saw the size of old Jack, the shape of family, and for the first time the raw horror in their eyes replaced bravado. One of them, older and perhaps with a sliver of conscience, said, "We didn't know." The phrase held a weak apology. The younger man looked away, and then, as if to finally admit the cost, he dropped his rifle. They left that day with their shoulders folded into grief that pretended to be practicality. They said they would call it in.
They left something else as well, a small note folded into a plastic bag, a barely coherent confession, and a promise that they would help if they could. I kept the note in my ledger. I was suspicious of promises because I had seen how promises could mutate into dossiers. Little Jack lived. He recovered slowly, with scars along his flank, and a change in the way he moved that I interpreted as a memory of the dog. The family retreated. Their presence became more ephemeral. They moved deeper and left fewer signs at the stump. Sometimes a single feather or a line of stones would be a message that they had passed through. Other times the world was silent, and I would go to the stump and leave an apple and find only my own prints to keep me company. There is an economy of loss in these stories. For every day I patched a body, another thing went missing. The number of places where they once slept diminished. Where once I found a ring of stones, there were now clearings scarred by human attempts to manipulate the land. The waterproof container filled up intermittently with clippings, and sometimes with new things that old Jack or Sarah had found and added, a ticket stub, a button, a scrap with unclear provenance. The artifact spoke of human crossings into their world and the terrible exchange that sometimes followed. In the spring of 2020, a year marked by so much else for the world, I found a final kind of evidence that taught me about the stubbornness of memory. I was in the cave one cold morning when I found, tucked into a crevice I hadn't noticed before, a thin cardboard folder. Inside were photographs, Polaroids, faded at the edges. They were images of men in uniforms, with faces I could not clearly make out, standing over a table where an object, animal hide, was displayed. On the back of one Polaroid someone had scrawled a date, indefinito. Another had initials. These were not the clippings of public newspapers. They were private prints, taken with the kind of intimacy that says, "We were there." I felt a nausea so deep it bent my knees. I will be careful here, because the rules I have lived by are not only legal but ethical. I cannot point fingers at particular departments or agencies. I can only say, as I have said in my ledger and to the few I trusted, that there is evidence suggesting parts of the system, some authorities, perhaps individuals acting within the flux of bureaucracy, had at times taken materials or remains in ways that were not publicly acknowledged. The language in the clippings, the chain of custody notations, and the private photos together suggested a pattern of intervention that stopped public scrutiny and began in private. Those are observations, not a verdict, and I say them only because I have held the paper and felt the weight of it. That same year, 2020, forced me into a practical decision as the valley's noise increased.
I started to place decoy items, objects that would attract curious hunters or camera crews and lead them away from core sites. I organized false paths and false features, small, harmless facades that made modern trackers waste energy and time. I would reroute a trail with a layer of bark, set up a false den of bones that were only rabbit bones, and plant human trash in a place where no one would think to look for the real family. It was tedious, clever, and I performed it with the grim humor of someone who knows the world is a ledger of small compensations. In these years, my relationship with the family transitioned into something like reverence. Old Jack's touches became rarer. His eyes retained their watchfulness. Sarah taught me new gestures, how to read the tilt of a branch as a map, how to hear the difference between a predator's sniff and a human's advance. Little Jack grew into a creature with a greater dignity, and, if I'm honest, an increasing reserve. He came to the stump from time to time, and once he left me a carved pebble the size of a coin, with a little wave pattern etched into it. I keep that pebble on my mantle. I have thought often about the phrase, "government files hid everything," the title that leans like a question at the front of this account. It is a claim heavy with accusation, and yet, in my ledger I have learned to weigh words like stones. Files hid things, yes. Files can conceal, annotate, and bury. They are the perfect tools for a world that prefers neat records to messy mortality. But the files I found were ragged and fragmented.
They were artifacts of people moving things out of sight, sometimes with intention, sometimes under the confusing cover of procedures. The lesson I learned is that the world that keeps secrets does so not always from unified malice, but from a messy institutional habit. People who worry about liability, about scandal, about control. There is guilt in that habit and there is danger, and both can be used to justify the removal of living beings from their places. I kept protecting because I believed in a different kind of accountancy. I would account for them in apples and hidden jars and notebooks under mattresses, not in public records that could be subpoenaed or misused. I kept the plaster casts wrapped, the waterproof container in 2 hiding places, and the ledger coded. I told myself this was the only way. And yet, even with every protected action I could muster, the world asks its own questions. In 2021, a wildfire pushed up from the valley and licked the lower ridges. It did not reach the core habitat, but it sent smoke into the canyons and pushed animals into new movement. Old Jack's notches changed. Little Jack's play behavior altered. Sarah's limping became more pronounced. There was an exhaustion in them that made the whole enterprise feel like saving water in a leaking bucket.
I was there one dusk when old Jack came to the stump, with his chest pressed to mine in that old solemn gesture. His fingers were cold and smelled like earth. He placed a flat stone into my hand, smooth, and with a faint groove, and then tapped my heart as if to bargain. In that moment, everything we had done and left unsaid condensed into a single, simple exchange. I had kept my promise. If there is a moral ledger in this life, it is written in small crumbs and soft things. I have no illusions about the future. I know the family may retreat deeper, may vanish into places even I cannot find, or may diminish over time in ways I will not witness. I also know that my keeping faith has allowed them a margin of survival they would not have had if I had chosen notoriety over care. That is a truth I carry with my bones. The last years of my watch have been quieter. I go out on winter mornings and leave an apple or 2. Sometimes I find a pebble in return, or a simple pattern of cut leaves laid like a blessing. Sometimes there is nothing. The counts in my ledger are irregular now, fewer encounters, longer gaps, a different kind of listening. I have conversations with younger rangers who are earnest and ignorant in equal measure, and I court their trust when I can. Bill is gone, and I visit his grave under the pines, telling him the parts of the story I think he would have understood without surprise. There are nights I dream of the cave and the tin jar and the Polaroids with dates of indefinito taped on their backs. I dream of how close grief and mercy live to one another. I dream of the moment I stepped into the clearing and the smell of powder and blood and fur. Those dreams are reminders that intelligence is not merely the ability to solve problems with tools or speech, but the capacity to hold memory and to respond to it, to make small vaults of evidence, to teach a child how to count notches into grooves, to form a community that mourns its own. I will not be the one to blow the whistle that brings a parade of cameras and trophies. I refuse that role because I have seen what publicity does to fragile lives. I will, however, tell this. Intelligence in the wild is not always the kind that wins awards or fits in journals. Sometimes it is the kind that wraps a wound and that knows to hide a photograph in a waterproof container. Sometimes it is arranging pebbles to say, "Leave this grove." That intelligence demands a kind of humility from us. If there is a wrongdoing here, it is not solely the action of a single man with a gun. It is the habit of a system that too often prefers tidy data over messy life, that files things away in ways that erase the living presences that were their source. The jars and clippings in the cave were not evidence of a neat conspiracy, but of a longer, fouler habit. Whenever discomfort comes near, our institutions sometimes choose containment rather than care.
That is a lesson as old as bureaucracy itself and as dangerous as any bullet. I have tried, imperfectly, to make amends. I have hidden, diverted, medicated, and completed what small repairs I could. I have also documented in careful shorthand the things I learned, in case there comes a day when those notes might be used to do something other than expose, used instead to build protections enforceable in law that do not require spectacle. I have copies of my plaster casts and of the photographs, kept in a single place with clarity only enough for future people who will need them for stewardship, not for profit. I do not post locations. I never will.
When people ask me, "What did he tell you? What did old Jack say?" I answer with gestures rather than doctrine. He showed me the economics of survival, how to count notches, how to keep a ledger of grief, how to pass along a wound's memory so a child knows that certain ridges are to be avoided. He taught me that intelligence includes the ability to adapt culturally, not just to make tools, but to make rules about land and to teach those rules to the next generation. Old Jack's silence was profound because it carried memory stronger than language. Now, in what may be the last of my watch, I make a modest request. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: intelligence in the wild deserves dignity and protection, and the impulse to expose should be tempered by the obligation to protect. The boxes in the cave and the files in the jar are not trophies. They are evidence of survival strategies and of violence done. They should never be treated as spectacle. I keep going back to the stump because it's the simplest oath I know. In the morning frost, I leave fruit and sometimes a small hand-carved bowl. I wipe a clean place on the log and sit a while. Sometimes old Jack appears, sometimes he does not. Sometimes I place my hand where he once placed his, and I feel my own heart beat against the bark. If this story reaches you and you are moved by it, consider the kind of care you can support. Conservation is not merely infrastructure, it is a set of moral choices about who we share the world with and how we do so. There are organizations that work in the spaces between law and survival, groups that fight for wild corridors and that offer real protection to habitats rather than checkbox solutions. Support those efforts. Ask hard questions and demand protections that do not require exposure as a condition of survival. I keep my vow because I learned the hard way what publicity can mean for fragile lives. I keep my ledger because memory must be held somewhere. I am an old man with a pocket full of plaster and a hand that remembers the warmth of old Jack's touch. When he touched my chest that last time, he did not give me proof so much as trust, and I have tried to merit it.
If you want to see the photos and the plaster casts, if you want the dry, forensic side of this, there is a link in the description with supporting images and notes. I say this only once, because I am a man of my promises. The materials are for scrutiny, not for expedition. They exist so the record is not solely whispered into pillows. There will be no grand exposé from me. There will be no trail marked for men with rifles and cameras to follow. What remains is a moral ledger. Apples left in stumps, a waterproof jar hidden under roots, a pebble on a mantle, and the quiet knowledge that intelligence in the wild can be as careful and loving as anything we call human. If this account troubles you, let it trouble you into action of a different sort. Subscribe to channels that investigate ethically and support organizations that fund habitat protection and anti-poaching efforts. Learn to listen to the small signs in the woods. Protect places that still have edges and doorways that hide memories. And if, when you walk in the woods, you find a ring of stones or a pile of berries arranged with care, consider leaving it be. Some things are not ours to own. Some things ask only that we remember, and that we, in our own small ways, keep a promise. Subscribe to follow more investigative stories that honor both curiosity and care. If you would like to support ethical conservation efforts connected to places like this, follow the links in the description. My work is simply to bear witness. The rest is for those with the power to protect life in ways that do not require spectacle. Old Jack once tapped my chest and seemed to say, without words, "Remember us." I will. I will hold the ledger, keep the apples, and keep the secret that keeps them alive.